All right, for the third in our series on doing TDD, I'm going to be doing things a little bit differently. I'm using Emacs as my editor instead of IntelliJ, and I'm going to be running the tests in a terminal. This is the way many people do it, and I wanted to do it this way just to kind of illustrate that running the test is very convenient, obviously, in IntelliJ, but you can do it no matter what editor you're using, and you're not really required to use something like IntelliJ to do it. All right, so in the last video, we had just finished writing one test, which was a course with no criteria assigned should have a score of 0, and that test was working. So to run that in a command line, what you do is you type Rails test, and you can see that it runs through. This every dot represents a test that's running, but most of these tests are actually in controllers, so we're not going to worry about them for right now. Okay. All right, so let's move on to our next test. So remember, you write the test, you get it working, and then you move on. So I'm going to uncomment this so you don't have to watch me type. So here's the second one. A course with one criteria assigned should have the score from that criteria. Now remember, this is called total score, but really it's going to be the average of all the scores. So it's the total score for the class. It's a way to think of it. All right, so what we need to do here is create a course on this line. We're going to create a criterion. Keep that from selecting like that. And then here we're going to add our new criterion to our course. And notice a couple of things here. I've got course.criteriaassignments.create. Well, criteria assignments is not something that we scaffolded in the original project. The table that we're using as an association table is called course criterion. And the problem here is that the pluralization that in Rails that normally works great didn't really work the way that I wanted it to for the word criteria. And so what I did is I used this alias attribute and said, I want to call course criterion, I want to call that criteria assignments. Okay. And then for the has many, I wanted to call it has many criteria. And then through the course criterion association table, and then I have to tell it, if I change this name, I have to tell it the source data type that I'm trying to work with here. So this allows us to do a little bit nicer pluralization. All right, so what I'm doing here is I'm saying, all right, I've got a course. I'm going to add, by calling create on it, another assignment. And this looks a little weird, but basically what happens is this is the list of criteria that we have. And I can just call create directly on it, pass it in the score, pass it in the criterion that I've already created up here. And then I'm going to, as a final step, I'm going to assert equal 10, which is the only criteria, equal to the total score. Okay, now, of course, as we expect, and as should happen, well, shoot, you know, what happened? That seemed to have worked. So the question is, did I save the file or not? And I don't know. Let's see, no files need to be changed. Okay, well, that's funny. So why would the total score come back 10, even though the total score back up here is 0? Aha! Well, it's because it didn't save that file. You know, you get used to IntelliJ saving whenever you quit, whenever you move. And sometimes you forget when you move to another editor. So let's try that again. And now it makes a little more sense. So we've got expected 10 and actual 0. Okay? And that's, of course, because this thing is only returning 0. So now we need to figure out, well, how do we do the average, or how do we just return that? Now, of course, if we just say, well, 10, which you might be tempted to do because that's what we did before, right? Well, pretty obviously that's going to not work, right? Because we expected 10, we expected 0, we actually got 10. So what's happening is this test is passing, but this test is not. And that's one of the tricks with test-driven design. You can't have your past tests fail. You always have to have the current test pass and all your previous tests, okay? So that's obviously not going to work. So let's do this. We're going to do self, and let's say we're going to see self.course criterion, and let's see that. Let's get the first one out of that array, because that's going to be an array of things. And let's see, what is that? That's going to be, that should be just a number, right? So course criterion first. Well, let's see what that does. Save the file, run the test. Okay, well now we get 0 expected, and instead we got nil. Okay, so what do we need to do with that? Well, we made a basic mistake here. This is a class, right? The first one out of this thing is going to be a class, and what we're really interested in is the score from that class. Okay, let's see what that does. Okay, so let's see, undefined score for nil.nil class. All right, so that's now saying that this first thing is empty, right? And let's see, what did this one up here say? Well, this one said, course with no criteria, that's okay. Course with no criteria should have a score of 0. All right, so that's the one that's failing at this point, right? So what are we getting back here when we run this? The first test is passing, or a test is passing, but a course with no criteria is failing because it has an undefined method of score. All right, so what should we do here? Okay, well, what should we do? So we've got course criteria. Well, we have a choice. We could start doing some conditional logic in here. So, because the one that is failing here is our first one, right? A course with no criteria. So the second test actually is passing. You see we have one error down here. And let's see, 1 error, 0 failures. But this is actually an error, right? That's not a failed test per se. And our other one is working, right? So if it's 10, this guy's working. This guy's not. All right, so what do we do? Well, we could do an if there, but let's do something a little more creative. Let's do this. What we're going to do is say, we're going to map this, and we're going to say, and we're going to get the score out of there. Okay. Now, what does this mess do? Well, if this is an array, even an empty one, map and score is going to create a new array that has in it just the score values from here. So this is kind of a shortcut in Ruby. And then now we can just say, well, let's get the sum out of that. Okay. Let's see what happens if that happens, if that works. Aha, it does. Why does it work? Well, because this thing is an empty array for our first guy here, and map doesn't blow up on us on that, right? So it just, well, let's see what it does. How can we figure that out? Well, we'll type IRB over here in our test thing, and you can see down at the bottom there, let's create an array, and well, let's do an empty array. And x.map, and then even though it's an empty array, I wonder if we can do and something or other and see what it does. Ah, see, it brings back an empty array. And an empty array dot sum is going to give us 0. So that's why this line works. Okay. What's essentially happening is this is going through and it's trying to call the method score on each element in this array, but there's nothing there, right? So it gets nothing, 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 and just returns an empty array for us. And the sum is kind of interesting. You would think that it might be 0, or rather it might be nil, but instead it comes out 0. So this works for us, okay? All right, so we've made our second test pass. Well, that's a fairly simple test. Let's see. I'm going to just, to avoid having you have to watch me type in stuff, we will just take this and copy it. We'll put our third test in. So this one is a course with many criteria should have the score be the average of all the scores. Remember, even though we call this total score, the total score for a course is actually the average of all the individual ones. Okay, so let's see what we have here. Same thing, we have a course, we have a criteria, and now basically we're just going to add it in twice. Now, in this simple little app, I didn't put anything in to prevent you from adding the criteria 2 times. Okay, in the real app, in our project app, we wouldn't want to do that. But here I've just added it twice, so I've got 10, 20, and so obviously we should get 15 as our result. Okay, so let's save this file, run the test, and see what we get. And it fails, as it should. Remember, if you write a new test and it doesn't fail, you may not actually be testing anything. Okay? All right, so now we've got a problem here. Let's see. Well, we've got an array of scores. I wonder if we can just do .average. Well, let's see. I'm going to save it, try to run. Nope. Undefined method average. All right, so that is not going to work for us. Well, let's see. We could just say, well, let's see, what is it? The average is actually the sum of all of them divided by how many of them there are, right? And so this, and here we can actually say course criterion dot length, because that's a thing we can do in Ruby, right? So course criterion dot length gives us the length of that array. Okay, so that seems like that would be okay, right? Whoops. Well, what happened here? The problem here is that we have a divide by 0 problem, right? So if we look at our code down here, this test is passing right here. This test is also passing, but our first one is not passing. And remember, the rule is every time I add a new test, every time I make it work, I must have all the rest of them work. All right, so the problem here is that we've got a divide by 0 issue, right? On that first test, if it's 0, it really is it's going to have to come back to be 0. And that's going to always happen because this guy is going to be length 0 if we haven't added any criteria. So now I am going to go ahead and use an if statement, but I'm going to use the other type. It's called unless. So unless is essentially the backwards if, right? So unless something is true, go ahead and do it. So we're going to do unless course criterion here, length is, well, what should we do? Should we say 0? Yeah, we could do it that way. Let's see. Unless it's equal to 0, we're going to do this. Else, if it is 0, we're just going to return 0. Okay, let's see what that does. And all our tests pass. Okay, so there's several other ways that you can do this. Of course, you could check to see if this is an empty array. That would be yet another way of doing it. But this is one way of going about it. So this is the way that test-driven development works. You build the simplest test possible. You know, the trivial case, right? Usually it's where you start. So, it should return 0 if there's none of them. And then you build up from there. And by the time you're done, then you have code that should work for any circumstance that you might encounter. Okay? All right, well, I hope that helps you understand test-driven development, and I'll see you in class.